There are growing calls to scrap Labor's so-called fresh food tax, which will charge farmers for the biosecurity costs associated with importers bringing their products into Australia. It's prompted concerns that this tax will be passed down to consumers, meaning that you might be paying more at the checkout. Joining me live is Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, thanks for your time. So the Albanese government's biosecurity protection levy has been introduced to Parliament. You're not happy that Australian producers will have to contribute to this and say it'll be passed on to consumers, affecting checkout prices. The government is trying to raise this money to strengthen biosecurity borders. So are producers worried about weak biosecurity in this country?
Well, they are, but there's a way to pay for it, and they shouldn't have to pay for those that pose the risk. Those that pose the risk should pay the price, and that's importers. And that happens to us when we export, when we send our goods to another country to process that and to make sure that their biosecurity protocols are maintained. Our farmers pay that cost at that border. Now, what this government is doing is saying Australian farmers should pay for their foreign competitors to bring their product to this country to mitigate the risk that they pose to our biosecurity systems.
Well,
now,
if we just break down who's paying for it. So taxpayers will pay the bulk of the $1 billion the government is trying to find here. Importers are paying 48% of the funding. Now, Labor says producers will need to pay a small share because they are the major beneficiaries of the new and improved system. So you're saying that that's not fair?
No, it's not, because they already pay. They pay also when they export. So farmers pay to make sure they've met our biosecurity exports to protect our brand. Then they pay again when our product hits another foreign country's shore. And so what we had was an alternative to this that we were going to implement in December 2022, which was a container levy. And this was to cover the costs of processing containers, and there was also a cost recovery model on bulk goods being imported in this country because they pose the risk to this country. They're the ones bringing pests and diseases here, and they're the ones that should pay for that. And in fact, we had support from importers on that because they wanted to have an efficient biosecurity system here that meant processing of goods through the ports were efficient. And this was actually a recommendation, an independent review by Wendy Craik that said that we should fund our biosecurity model predicated on who poses the risk. So it is well within WTO rules that if we recover the costs of covering those importers, the risk that they pose, that we're well within WTO rules. But why would we pass that on to Australian farmers when they already pay within the levies that they put out there, levies to biosecurity, to Plant Animal Health Australia, to cover biosecurity costs? We're asking them to pay for more, so that has to be passed on. When there is an alternative, to charge importers.
There's plenty going on in politics. I just want to ask you about this. Former US President Donald Trump sat down for an interview with Nigel Farage. He had some choice words for our US ambassador and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, saying that he heard Mr Rudd was a little bit nasty and not the brightest bulb. This is a fairly new story, but can I get some reaction from you? Trump said that if he was elected again, that Kevin Rudd probably wouldn't last long in that job in Washington. Quite an extraordinary statement from the former president, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, look, and I think it emanates from the fact that Kevin Rudd's had gratuitous advice for Donald Trump and what he thinks of Donald Trump. And I find it extraordinary that Kevin Rudd, who's had experience in the diplomatic corps and then as a Prime Minister, has wanted to weigh in on foreign politics and then ended up as the ambassador in the United States. It shows that he was a poor choice to start with. And now if we have a Trump administration, that we're going to have a very difficult time in negotiating with the new administration, particularly with things as important as AUKUS. And I think this is a problem for the government. They mismanaged this, and Kevin Rudd should have known better than to make disparaging comments about a potential future president of the United States. It showed a lack of judgment, and particularly someone that's had experience, not just as Prime Minister, but in the diplomatic corps. And I think Donald Trump obviously is lashing out at somebody that is there representing Australia that should have known better.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Australia at the moment and is right now in bilateral talks in Canberra. He was spotted at a winery overnight as well. We still have those crippling trade sanctions in place on Aussie wines. Are you reading much into this?
Yeah, look, I hope that there'll be an announcement in the coming days that China will take away those punitive penalties that were unfounded to start with. But I think much of the heavy lifting has been done by the Chinese ambassador here. He's come here wanting to turn the page, and I've made it clear to him, as I know the government has, that they need to actually demonstrate with actions that the page has been turned, and removing those tariffs on wine is important. And I hope that we'll see that. It's important for the government to understand it'll take time for us to re-enter that market and get back on the shelves and into the households of Chinese people. But it's also important they continue to fight for. There's about 8 meat establishments that are still banned in China, as well as rock lobster. So it's important that China continues on this pathway, but a positive step. And I think what it's also important is that the government continues on that trajectory of defending the values and principles of our great nation, our democracy, without interference, and making sure that there is clear lines of delineation articulated to the Chinese government. And if there is, then trade should operate unimpeded, and that a rules-based world order of trade should be adhered to at all times.